over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah and Lori. And it's so great to see everybody. Thank you for joining on a Thursday night. And I'm so excited to see so many faces I haven't seen in a long time. Justin and Jordan and Dana and Ben and Allie and Nina. Thank you for joining. I can't see your faces, but that's okay. Really looking forward to starting a conversation. So I'm going to be talking about new work, as Lori mentioned, from Necessary Fictions. It's part of a book I have coming out with Radius later this year, due in huge part to the generosity of the Lannan Foundation. And I'm still working through some of these ideas. So I look forward to hearing your take on it. So let me see if I can share my screen. And there we go. Is that successful? You got, yeah, okay. So to tell you about the new work of Necessary Fictions, I need to start in 2015 with the project on Guantanamo Bay. And when I went for the first of 3 visits, I was looking to figure out how to get people to look again at something that after over a decade, many Americans had stopped paying attention to. And I got very lucky in the sense that my military escort said to me on the first visit, Gitmo's the best posting a soldier could have. There's so much fun here. So instead of taking the same picture, I looked at the fun, yes, Sarah, you're muted.
I know, I'm sorry. We're just now seeing your picture, your screen. I just didn't know. Is this the first one you were sharing?
Yes.
Awesome, we're all good then.
Okay, good. Thank you. So I looked at what I was being asked to see. I photographed the gift shop souvenirs like this toddler tea available for $7.99. I photographed soldiers off duty lounging on Windmill Beach, just down the hill from the complex of what they call detention centers up to the left that I was not allowed to photograph from this vantage point. Just real disconnects between the messaging that I was given and what I knew to be going on there that I wasn't allowed to see. Photographing the kiddie pool for the children of civilian and military staff, of course not for the men held without charge or trial. So I was just really struck working in a place where reality was stage managed for public consumption. And in the next year, as I put together my book and started looking to make new work, that was 2016, as the presidential election was taking place. And I really sat with this idea of power being managed, reality being managed by power. And I came across this quote: "We're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. We're history's actors, and you, all of you, will be left to just study what we do." It's a 2004 quote from Karl Rove, who was at the time George W. Bush's chief political advisor. He was quoted anonymously at the time. But coming back to it these many years later, this really resonated with me as remarkably candid, as a distillation of how American power operates, setting up on one hand history's actors, those who act on behalf of the state and create realities, and on the other hand, the rest of us, right? Those of us who parse state-created realities, those of us who are acted upon, who absorb this messaging, and who are left to make sense of it. And I've come to understand my evolving practice as one of studying state-created realities, what I call necessary fictions. How do these structures operate? How do they operate on us? What is concealed and what is revealed? How are they operating on the players, those who write them, those who enact them, those who are operated upon? So necessary fictions developed starting in 2016, looking more specifically at the staging and performance of American power. Specifically, in this moment we're living in, it's a time of perpetual war. It's a time of constant vigilance at home. It's a time of incredible political division. So against this backdrop, what are the stories we tell? What are the games we play to manage unsettling realities? I decided to look at the post-September 11th wars. These are the conflicts that began in October of 2001 in Afghanistan following the September 11th attacks, continuing to Iraq in 2003, and over the last 18 plus years, now extending to operations in over 80 countries around the world. I wanted to look at the destruction of these wars. I wanted to look at the human toll, both abroad and at home, by combatants and civilians. And I wanted to bring home something that, unless it's part of your daily reality as a combatant or civilian in one of these environments, for many Americans, this is written off as taking place over there, right? Having nothing to do with us. So I wanted to look at the stories told about these conflicts. And the way that I did that was by spending a lot of time in a place that has not gotten much press. It's a place called Atropia.
The enemy is disguised among you now. They don't wear uniforms anymore. So we're trying to do everything we can to ensure your safety.
If we know who's the enemy and who's these bad people, if we recognize them, we will be the first people to tell them. 30 minutes ago, we just came in here and we reported. We reported people.
And we're very thankful.
The location, we gave them everything, all the information that they needed.
So I traveled quite extensively for this work, but I never left the United States. Atropia is a fictional country that exists on American military bases. I photographed 10 of them over the last 3 years. I photographed the mock Afghan and Iraqi villages constructed to host immersive, realistic military war games for troops preparing to deploy. These include mosques, or if you look more closely, sort of creatively intra-denominational spaces. The storefronts, the shops, the inhabited spaces, the villages, all constructed to look enough like the kinds of places that American soldiers and Marines and National Guard troops would find, and yet slightly off, right? The markets with fake fruit and a surveillance camera. The idea in these spaces is to create a sense of fidelity. So there's physical fidelity, making the environment look similar enough that it won't come as a shock to American soldiers, but also a sense of psychological fidelity. So filled with props. Again, there's something a little bit off. They stopped before things got too close to home. And at the same time, as I photographed the landscapes and the props, I photographed the players. These are Men and women who are civilian Afghans and Iraqis, many of whom have fled war in their countries of origin only to recreate war in costume in the service of the US military as inhabitants of the country of Atropia. Each of these cultural role players, they're called, is playing out some alternative version of their past, maybe as a shopkeeper, maybe as a village elder, or maybe as an insurgent or as a suicide bomber. Maybe they're asked to play a casualty of war. I also photograph the real soldiers, Marines, National Guardsmen and women who are enacting these training scenarios, sometimes right before getting on airplanes to deploy. And they too are put through scenarios intended to be as realistic as possible within the fictional spaces and the fictional storylines. They are subjected to the sights and the sounds and sometimes even the smells of battles and of foreign environments, with the idea that this will build muscle memory and the hope that it will inoculate them against the traumas of war. This is something I'm fascinated by, skeptical of, and curious about. So at times it can get quite loud. Just a word of warning to those who may be sensitive to these fictional battle sounds that I recorded. So wait a minute, that's kind of a gory, explicit picture. That's not what we typically are shown. Historically, we get something more like this. It turns out that eBay trolling is part of my process. Historically, back in, say, World War II, we would see the romantic version of the soldier dressed in crisp uniform, brandishing the weapon, dominating that weapon, right? We will be the victor. We can joke because we know we'll win. As time went on, the Vietnam War era snaps get a little bit more candid in their expression, but the posing remains the same. We're going to be giving, not receiving when it comes to war. And this is true in the press and in governmental visual messaging. For a very long time, from 1991 to 2009, there was a ban on showing photographs of flag-draped coffins of soldiers returning from battle. This is the front page of a Seattle Post Intelligencer from 2004, featuring a photograph by Tammy Cericio, who was a military contractor coming back on this transport. And this photograph got her fired when it was published in 2004. In fact, it took Freedom of Information requests and litigation to force the United States government to release others' photographs like this, documenting the reality for American soldiers who became casualties in the many wars, resulting in sometimes quite absurd imagery, hand redacted by government censors. I've just discovered a trove of these photographs. And again, I'm fascinated by what this hand redaction, not of the soldier himself or herself, but those attending in the honor guard to the fallen warriors, what that says what kind of message the government is sending in concealing the identity of all of those attendant to these procedures. Is it shameful? Is it embarrassing? Is it dangerous? What are we meant to take from these redactions? And this is all just the kind of thinking that I'm doing as I'm on these spaces, photographing the mock wars playing out, the games that soon will be all too real. In 2009, the ban on flag-draped coffins was lifted. And meanwhile, it had been rare for us to see photographs of both fallen soldiers and injured soldiers. Nina, who is on the call, and I would love to be in conversation with soon, in a few moments, was one of the few documenting injured soldiers in her series and book, Purple Hearts, published by Trolley in 2004. These are tender, heartfelt, and at times hard to look at, but very important photographs. In the mainstream press, again, it was quite rare to show the American soldier in anything other than a heroic pose. In fact, one critique in the War is Beautiful photo book published front page New York Times war photographs over a period of years, and made the argument that the collective subconscious of the New York Times essentially just aestheticized war and reduced its cruelty, its violence to beautiful colors and shapes, therefore further separating its readership and the American public from the realities of war. More recently, there's been a real resurgence, more broad spread resurgence, I should say, of a conversation about which bodies we see and which are shown to us in the mainstream press. And I think this is a critically important conversation. Sarah Santilles wrote this article for the New York Times Magazine a couple of years ago, really pulling out how the American public is fed images and which images we tend to be shown. We don't tend to be shown the image of fallen American soldiers or injured American soldiers, despite the reality that they have been deployed and are being killed as they kill constantly. We are shown Black and brown bodies as victims of war abroad, and as fallen victims of police shootings here at home. We tend not to be shown the white bodies. What do we make of that? And how can we move forward from that? Turns out there is actually an American history of depicting war injuries, but you have to go much further back before Nina's body of work to the Civil War. And there was a real purpose behind this kind of photograph. There's a doctor in Harewood Hospital in Washington, D.C. that tended to wounded Union soldiers. And this doctor, as part of his practice of treating gunshot wounds, would document each patient, take his pedigree information, and hand draw the trajectory of the bullet and these remarkable artifacts of war. These images helped each of the soldiers get pensions. So there were very practical reasons for the documentation, practical reasons that impacted the lives of the soldiers. I don't yet know in my research the extent to which these were disseminated at the time, certainly not the way our media is capable of disseminating imagery. But it led me to realize I should as well find a way to document injuries of real American soldiers. And so that's what I've done. And I'd be really curious to hear from you in the conversation in a few moments, what you see in this picture of a real American soldier and his injuries, her injuries? What does it bring up for you, if anything? What do you see? This series of photographs is actually still part of the war games. These National Guardsmen and women have been dressed by Hollywood makeup artists in what's called moulage, Hollywood makeup, in preparation for mass casualty events. The training is for the medics, but these soldiers are also preparing to deploy. What does it mean for them to be dressed this way? And that's exactly what I ask them. I have only a few moments with each of them, but I ask each of them the same question. How does it feel to be made up this way, knowing that you are about to deploy abroad? For some of them, it's just a joke. It makes me laugh, they say. Another young man listened to the question and was silent for quite a few minutes as I continued to make pictures. Then all he said was, I just got married. What does it mean to look at the possible futures? You know, just as the cultural role players are playing out alternative versions of their past, these National Guardsmen and women are playing out their possible futures. What does it mean for us to look at that? In the book, I ask a lot of these questions, and I include a lot of research about PTSD, about the impact of war on civilians in Afghanistan and Iraq, on soldiers. Is it easier to look at these pictures knowing that they're fake? Does it make no difference? As I start thinking about showing this work in an exhibition space, when we again have physical environments in which to show, I'm looking to experiment with a conversation between and among visitors like you, to have this conversation. What does it bring up for you? What do you see? So the book is on its way across the Atlantic, and pre-orders are available. I'm thrilled to be able to have a range of different kinds of writing. There's poetry by Nomi Stone. There's an original short story by veteran and author Roy Scranton, who's the author of War Porn, a remarkable novel, and critical essays, both from a historical perspective, photographic perspective, and more of a pop culture perspective by Makita Best and Sarah Santilles. It is a heavy volume. Give you a sneak peek of it here with this page turn. We've organized it loosely as a kind of dossier, kind of a State Department guide to the fictional country of Atropia. You know, those State Department guides give you a rundown of what to expect in a place. It's vital statistics, if you will. So we start with the geography of this place, the location, the landscapes. We move forward to the population, the resources, and tell some stories. The book is interwoven with a number of different texts that I have both collected and written myself, some personal thoughts and interactions with the role players and the soldiers. I quote quite extensively from my conversations and interactions with them, with their permission. More of the casualties here, of the soldiers, and then a case study, which I can show you a little bit more of if you'd like, in this booklet, which tells a true story of an incident in which distinguishing fantasy from reality became the difference between life and death, using original exhibits from a court case, and which I will be telling in a number of different ways with different media, if I'm able to raise funds going forward. There's, at the end of the book, after all of the back matter and the essays and the stories and the poetry, one more little secret that I'm not going to show you, that has one more element there. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen at this point, if I can figure out how to do it. Stop share. And I see there are some chats. There are a couple of other elements that I can show you. I want the conversation that the work poses to be not only about war games. And you'll see that from the text, and I can share some specifics in these other elements that I have teed up, but maybe it's a conversation about our forever wars. Maybe it's a conversation about how militarized we've become as a culture. Maybe it's a conversation about fake news. Maybe it's a conversation about what's happening to us right now, and the stories we tell ourselves and the games we play just to make sense of what we are all collectively going through and how we see our futures playing out. There's a lot of different directions it can go. I'm going to show you an adapted version of a teaser for a film that I made called Jade Helm. And then maybe Laura, you can guide the conversation or suggest what we can do next. I'm going to share my screen again. And this is again, it's a film, but because we've had some trouble with video, I've adapted it to be a slideshow with audio. So hopefully we'll get the timing right. It's just a couple minute teaser of what is a 16-minute experimental film. And to set it up, I should say, it's a story about something that happened in 2015 in which entire communities mistook war games for the real thing. And in the film, I'm asking, how on earth did this happen? And how did our institutions fail us?
There are two words we're about to say that some of you will know immediately and probably won't like. Jade Helm.
Operation Jade Helm. It is called Jade Helm.
Jade Helm, a large-scale military exercise that sparked widespread fear.
The conspiracy theories are running wild. A foreign invasion, martial law.
Hashtag Jade Helm. I mean, there's days with thousands of tweets.
Officials insist most of that fear is irrational.
But what's really happening?
We just want to hone our skills. When we have a federal government that cannot tell the truth, how do we know that what you're saying is true?
A growing distrust of the government from people who are usually waving the flag.
I can tell you right now, this is not a drill.
We don't come in, we don't take over. We want the community to accept us.
That's what they would say, wouldn't they?
They're trying to come to our houses and kill us.
It is a preparation for martial law. That's because it is not a preparation for martial law. So that's what you say.
Is our federal government coming in and going to practice imposing martial law on Texas?
Some are calling it a Texas takeover.
The country is a ticking time bomb. A time bomb.
3 men charged, accused of stockpiling guns, grenades, and even bombs. The operation that investigators say motivated them to be ready to fight the government.
The criminal complaints give us a window into why the FBI says the 3 men are facing conspiracy charges. It's a troubling and bizarre plan they're accused of crafting, possibly related to other conspiracy theories about a military takeover in Texas.
Jade Helm 15 might be just training exercises, but there's no doubt it started some kind of war, and this time it's between America and itself.
Lots of people are reacting tonight to a potentially embarrassing possibility.
Remember all those Facebook posts about Jade Helm a few years ago?
No one expected who was behind helping to spread that fear around the state.
Russia.
As the CIA now confirms Russian bots fueled the propaganda.
And the former head of the CIA thinks a Texas reaction may have been the green light for Russia to ramp up campaigns in America.
Okay. I'm going to stop sharing and I can tell you the Pineland story, but I'm more interested, frankly, in the conversation. If there are questions, Lori, do you want to maybe?
Yeah, there are some questions, but because I have the first one. I would like to have you unpack the word necessary in your title a little bit. Yeah.
I'm looking at it as a bit of a provocation. I mean, it's a rhetorical question. What is necessary? It's my translation of state-created realities. From the state perspective, from the Rovian version of power, it is part of the role of the state is to create its own story. So from the state perspective, it's necessary. I'm asking, is it implicitly or now explicitly, since you've asked me to articulate it?
I have a question from Holly. Could you speak to the process of gaining permission to photograph and then how the military responds to the work and if that has any effect on repeat visits?
Well, the process for getting access to the bases for necessary fictions was much simpler than it was for getting access to Guantanamo. So if you're trying to get to Guantanamo, you've got to figure out who to apply to, which is not straightforward. You have to do a proposal, you have to be approved, you have to go through a background check and pass it. For me, it was 9 months from start to finish. Here, it was less of an issue, in part because, as I was told much later, I have a very good reputation with the military because of my work on Guantanamo. And I think one of the things that I took from that is that images are a Rorschach test. And maybe there's a necessary fiction answer to your question there. In Guantanamo, I was photographing guard spaces that don't typically get depicted, and that was very welcome. Of course, I added context to those pictures later in photographing prisoner spaces, photographing released so-called detainees and their lives after Guantanamo, and incorporating classified documents of the bureaucratization of violence into the book. So in necessary fictions, there was not the same oversight of my pictures. In Guantanamo, they need to look at every picture you take every single day, and they will delete whatever violates the 12 pages of rules that you've signed as a condition of being there. Here, there was not that process because whatever I was allowed to see, I was allowed to photograph, with the one exception of sort of a robot device that I was told not to photograph and abided by. Those who allowed me access have not seen anything other than some images in a viewfinder. I'll probably send a copy of the book to my primary host, and I'll be able to report back you know, what the reaction is. And I really do hope to include veterans, members who are serving, members who've been through these kinds of exercises as part of the conversation. That's very important to me, actually. I found in my work with Guantanamo that including a range of people who have a range of experiences with respect to the subject matter can really be transformative, rather than having a one-sided conversation among people who agree with each other.
Thank you. I also want to just open the floor up. I don't have to read all the questions, but I'm gonna kick it off here. And then this one's from Ben Altman. And Ben, if you have a follow-up, just feel free to unmute yourself and follow up with it. Ben writes, could you get any assessment of how effective the training is given the manifestly fake appearance of the scenarios?
It's really hard for me to tell. I'm starting to be in conversation with people who've returned back after serving, who also went through the training. And I don't yet have a good answer for you. It's a question that I'm also quite curious about. I've spoken with the trainers, who of course have a vested interest in a message that says the training is very effective. I've read a lot of research, psychological research, sort of underpinning the approach of creating psychological and physical fidelity as a way of creating muscle memory and inoculating against trauma. And there are studies that have been done. So I see that data. I'm still skeptical. So that is, I feel like my practice is more about asking these questions and finding research in the process of making and disseminating the work. So I'm not sort of packaging it as a completed thought. Even I'm incorporating these questions into the process of making the work and bringing it into the world as an ongoing conversation.
I'm going to keep reading, but feel free to come in. This is from Tasso Hartzog. What motivated you to your return to art after working as a lawyer?
Yes. I just had been craving working with the other side of my brain. You know, I've been this deadline-driven, analytical person, and that's who I thought I was for most of my life, very much including those 18 years from my first job out of college as an investigator for the Federal Public Defender's Office through law school and lawyering. But there was this other side of me that I just didn't have time for, and I wanted to develop it. And I was tired and I was exhausted and burnt out as a lawyer. As important as the work I was doing was to me, I felt like it was time to live differently. So while as a lawyer, I would approach questions like this from the perspective of proving the truth, you know, and making a compelling argument that had only one outcome. I find that less interesting now at this point in my life, and working as a visual artist in multimedia, I find it much more interesting to hone the questions and pose the questions and have the work be a process of answering them and teasing them and being in conversation about them, rather than having things be binary. It's just much more interesting to me.
Anna Bodkin, who is a phenomenal author and a former war correspondent, asks, she writes, I have a question about asking questions. How do you make the decision to ask soldiers in a reenactment who are reenacting casualties about what it means to them? What happened after the guy told you he just got married? I've asked many such questions in the 15 years plus of documenting wars, so asking retroactively.
It's incredibly delicate. I'm used to building relationship with clients who I work with for years. As a photographer, as a writer, as a journalist, all of those of us who work in these situations understand that process is incredibly compressed for us. You know, we have maybe a few hours, in my case with these people, usually a few minutes. And it starts from the moment that you see each other before they're sitting in front of the camera, from being vulnerable together, from being curious about their lives, building rapport, joking or fumbling, in my case with equipment. And sometimes you don't get an answer that feels candid. But most of the time I did. And I think the answers reflect as much about what's happening for the person who's answering as it does about the dynamic that we've created, as it does about the environment we're in. I mean, it's a really human thing to say, oh, it's just a joke. It feels like Halloween. Like, what do we do with a difficult situation? What do we do with what's happening right now? We say, it feels like we're in a movie, you know, and now that we're beyond the initial trauma of it, many of us, I hope, you know, they're jokes, right? It's a distancing, it's a self-preservation. But asking that question, you know, sometimes you just have these emotional moments with people. And with that specific soldier, in answer to your question, I don't know, I kind of held this space. Is that super cliche to say? I nodded and I was just present with him in that moment, you know, and said, yeah, what more can you say?
Thank you for that. I have unmuted myself, I think. Yes?
Hi. Yes, you have.
Hi, Debbie. Really astonishing work. Thank you very much for being with us today. I guess I asked that question because I think of our responsibility as documentors, because clearly we know we're driven by our sense of responsibility to our audience, let's put it generally. But I think about how do we also feel responsible to our subjects.
Absolutely.
We document the subjects. I think it's a very, that's why I asked the question. And I've never been in a reenactment. I've been in real war zones, and I've asked a lot of questions that were probably terrible. And I probably asked a lot of questions that were hopefully good. But it's an interesting role of a documenter, especially somebody who's outside the community. This is why I no longer work as a journalist. The coming in and then the leaving, and then we plant a seed, and then we do not watch what happens with it, right, in people's hearts. So that was why I was curious. I'm also looking at your images, you know, and thinking, oh my God, like I'm thinking, I know this woman, I know this guy who, you know, who was able to leave Afghanistan or able to leave Yemen or able to leave Iraq. And now he is in this macabre simulacrum of his home. And I actually would like to hear more about that, more of what you saw in these interactions of people who are being re-traumatized for money, right?
Well, this was another huge question for me, is the Afghan and Iraqi civilians, these naturalized Americans, and what drew them to these environments. What's it about for them? Is it re-traumatizing to be surrounded by shelling and gunfire? And, you know, I returned to one of these locations, 29 Palms, the Marine training grounds, 4 times, spending about a week each time. So I was able to get to know some of the role players and some of the trainers better than, I won't say well, but better. And I got a range of responses about, you know, why they were there, what it was about for them. For some of them, it was, and I write about this in the book, for some of them it was, you know, America brought us over during the war with Russia. We're so grateful. We're patriotic Americans. We want to give back. You know, our son is in the Air Force now. So that was a recurring theme of, we're patriotic Americans now, we want to give back. There was one man who was proud to tell me he had served in Saddam's special forces and told me all about that. And I said, well, you know, what does it bring up for you? And he said, I feel nostalgic being in this environment. You know, it was like sort of a return to the glory days. And the word spreads, you know, then there's a second generation of the kids of the older generation who came from Afghanistan, or younger people who've come more recently from Iraq. And for some of them, it was, we assisted special forces in Iraq, and it wasn't safe for me to stay. So I had these relationships and I became aware of the opportunity, so I'm doing it. And of course there's money. There can be very good pay under really, really challenging circumstances, 100+ degree heat, 23-hour days, no electricity, on and on and on. And, you know, labor lawsuits are actually quite a bit of the material that I gathered and using in text. Because this is a whole other element, is the commodification of war brought home, and this performance as labor and value, and part of the fantasy industrial complex, this buying and selling and consuming of war. So many questions, like there's so many different levels to it.
That's really what you do. I mean, that's what the work does, and it really is astounding. I want to read a question by Ron Tarver, who's a photojournalist and an educator. Ron, please feel free to follow up. I'd like to speak to the role of newspapers play in showing images of war. Having worked on news desks for many years and having battles with editors over which image will go in the paper, it comes down to what readers will be tolerant of. If you show a photo that is too offensive, you're running the risk of losing readers. At the other end, you feel you're not showing really what's going on. Hard decision. And then Anna follows up with, how do editors feel equipped to make decisions about readers' tolerance? And then Ron replied, by how many cancellations the papers receive the next day.
Yeah, I mean, it's from the editor's perspective, I see that. I think from the consumer's perspective, that's very much in conversation right now. Like, what is the visual response to the pandemic? You know, should we be showing bodies? Should we not be showing bodies? Should we be showing images of first responders looking valiant and proud? Should we be showing photographs of those who've recovered? I mean, these are really thorny questions. I think the position that I've come to in this work is that we can almost be more honest in depicting the fictionalized gain. We can look at the injuries. We can really look at them knowing that that person's body is still intact. It's a gesture towards a possible future, and that is sobering, whether it's a civilian or a soldier. But we can look, and isn't it our responsibility to look? You know, these wars, if we are American, these wars are being waged in our names. It's hard to look, and we are overloaded with imagery. And from the editor's perspective, I can't show it if people are going to be turned off by it, but there's a reality, and we don't want to be whitewashing either. We don't want to, so there's kind of a pendulum. There are two ends of a spectrum. And for me, the question is, in all of my work, how do I invite the gaze? How do I invite you to look if you have really strong feelings one way or another, or if you think this has nothing to do with you? The image has to, like, maybe can grab you here. That can be the start of a conversation. A visceral reaction can be the start of a conversation if it's done with care and in context. Which is why, you know, conversation is more of interest to me than just showing you pictures. It's why showing you the book with the text and the quotes and the different forms of written material make more sense to me than just pictures. An installation with sound, right? You can get to the many layers, you can have a conversation, you can explore nuance that way that you can't in a 12-image essay.
Anna, you have your hand up. Oh,
that's from before.
Okay. Yeah, never mind. Brad McCollum, has your work from the series been shown, or do you see the book as a vehicle for the work to be shown? Do you see the individual images having a life as object images outside of the publication?
It's brand new work, so only a couple of images have been shown. There's up behind closed doors right now at the Leica Gallery Boston. I'm in a group show of Leica Women Photo Award winners with 2 other wonderful photographers. But there are only a small number of prints there. I'm most interested in having them shown, again, in context. For individual images, maybe, but for example, for American audiences, the injured soldiers, the moulage pictures are very sensitive. And in thinking about promoting the book, I'm very careful. I'm not going to post an injured soldier on Instagram. Just not going to do that to create this orphaned image outside of a context. And of course, I understand that we only have so much control. But my goal is to hold back the work until it can be presented, and then it can have a life, but at least I will tee it up with a foundation that shows the respect I have for each of the people I've collaborated with to make the work, and the nuance with which I'm trying to think about it. And then, we'll see. I would very much love for the work to be exhibited, to be part of a larger conversation. And we'll see where and when that may happen. My next focus is really on figuring out the case study and how to translate that into film. And I'm getting to the point where I think I'm going to be telling the same story in multiple different ways and experimenting with how it's read differently and how it is revealed differently through the repetition in a different form.
One of the things about Welcome to America in the presentations that you did as the exhibition moved around, you always, you valued and made it a priority to have these conversations with people that are part of the story and, people who can address the issues from a broad range. Do you think you'll be doing that with this project?
Yes.
And how?
Yes. In really the same way, with Guantanamo, we always had someone who'd been released appearing by Skype because they could not appear in person, a civil rights lawyer, a former guard, a former interrogator, someone who had another visual perspective on the work. And those conversations have been transformative for those participating, some of them. And I really hope we can do that with this work as well. It's part of the reason why I was thrilled to be able to include Royce Granton's work. He's served. I want to be including some of the role players to talk about, to be able to answer in their own words rather than laundered through my voice, why they participate and what it's about for them. Yeah, that's going to be very important, especially in the United States. And I think with all of my work, the conversation tends to be slightly different in the US than it is abroad. There's just, I'm all the more aware and cognizant of the need to broaden a coalition of conversation, if you will, in the United States, because of that intolerance that Ron referred to. For many Americans, to be patriotic means one thing. Maybe it means to serve, maybe to be patriotic means to critique your government. But though right now the space we're in is not having those two come together, and I'm trying to develop a method that creates a space to acknowledge and be aware of and respect varying positions and to engage together despite them, while being principled about the nature of power and how it operates on us.
Deb, it's 8 o'clock. I'm always have to spend a lot of time thinking about all I learned from you. So thank you very, very much. Thank you, everybody who joined this conversation. It's quite an honor for everybody to share the space and be part of this conversation. I do want to say next week, Zoe Strauss is going to be our Thursday night photo talk. So I hope you can join us next week. And please send Deb your love in the chat or on in person, because the session's over now. So feel free to speak out and shout out and share.
Thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for hosting.
It was fun.
Take care, everybody.
Thank you, Debbie.
For work. Congratulations.
Looking forward to the book.
Me too.
We'll send a link out. Yeah, we'll send a link out with the to pre-order the book. Also, if you have a chance, Anna put in some great references of films and books and articles to read. So make sure you have a look at that. See you next week.
Take care.
I guess I'll email. I don't know if she can hear me, but Debbie, there's an organization, if you don't know about it, called Songwriting with Soldiers. And I can I'll email you, but they do, yeah, they pair veterans of all different kinds, from, you know, special ops, super secret, to they do workshops, and they pair them with songwriters and to work through PTSD, and they do concerts, and I think they, you know, they have an album, and the organizers are really great. And I actually heard about it through a photo collector, believe it or not.
No, I'd love to see that. Thank you.
Yeah, it's an organization I've supported a little bit, and I think they're doing some wonderful stuff. So I'll email you the info.
Thank you. Thank you.
Really wonderful. Thank you.